trouble.
Double trouble. All right. Well, for any of y'all, I mean, most of y'all are familiar enough with me. I'm Nathan. I'm the worship guy. For any of y'all who might not know, and you're wondering, who is this curly-haired flip-flop man? This is Ethan. Ethan is, if you don't know, our intern, but he's also been coming here for a number of years now. Started in high school, and now he's here working, and he's also a part of a group who exist in the shadows called Shepherding Council. If you don't know about them, it's Adam and David have taken it upon themselves to take some people under their wing. So that would be myself, Ethan, and Jimmy, to go over what it looks like to pastor, to shepherd, those kinds of things, to try to suss out that calling, what that would mean for us, and then to also take part in sermon lab and workshop. And today, the sermon's going to look a little bit different. And as you might gather from the video, we're talking about the wisdom books that Solomon wrote. And that typically, even though Solomon didn't write Job, wisdom literature usually includes Job. But we talked about Job way back at the beginning of the year. But today, we played that video because it's going to be able to summarize all of the themes in Solomon's books together very nicely. But today you're in for a little bit more of a doozy because we're going to focus specifically on Ecclesiastes. So you get to listen to the guy in seminary and a philosophy major talk about Ecclesiastes. So what we're going to do is first of all, I should probably open up my Bible. That would be good. But what I think to do is I'm just going to throw it out there. Why focus on Ecclesiastes? Out of all the choices, why focus on this one?
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the easy way to answer that question is we're going through the whole Bible, and this upcoming week will be our week for Ecclesiastes, I think. And but more importantly, the reason we're doing it this way is to kind of showcase some of how we do our sermon labs for every week. We all get on a call on Friday mornings with David or Adam or whoever's going to preach, and we work on it together and talk about how can we use this message to lead our church in the right way, to see what each of us is called to do, and how the whole church is called to something from the sermon. So when we talk about why Ecclesiastes, we could get into several things. Do you have a starting point?
I mean, I was just going to say, because it's so different from all the other books. So Proverbs,
yes,
it's little pithy wisdom sayings that Solomon gives, like, hey, if you do this, then this. And it's, a lot of, you have them on your coffee mugs, on your mouse thing, whatever that's called. You got that black border picture with some sort of inspirational picture, and like in the white text underneath, it'll be like as iron sharpens iron, and
you pull a ton of stuff out of it.
Yeah,
and it's 31 chapters, so it's really good to do like this month. I'm going to read Proverbs 1 chapter a day, and just be that guy.
Yeah. So it's there, and we can always go to it whenever we're in times of need or we need wisdom, but all at the same time, Ecclesiastes takes that wisdom, but then approaches it in a very, very grounded way.
Yeah.
So whenever you see things like, this is Father's Day, and so I'm certain that a lot of you all in the room are going to be very acquainted with that phrase of raise up a child in the way they should go.
Don't give them snakes.
Yeah, Jesus said don't give them snakes. But it says Proverbs will tell us raise up a child in the way they should go, and they will continue to fear the Lord. It's that kind of idea. But all at the same time, we know kind of intuitively in our gut that that's not necessarily a promise.
Yeah.
We can try as hard as we might, but sometimes, I was a kid once. Kids do dumb things.
Yeah.
So it's it's taking Proverbs, it's good, but all at the same time, Ecclesiastes kind of takes, if it kind of takes Proverbs and kind of twists it around in the light like a diamond to try to get everything out of there as possible, and it really critiques it and grounds the book, because the author kind of comes out the gate swinging. Whenever he just says the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem, who's usually thought to be Solomon late in life.
Right.
If not Solomon, just some Israelite king who's incredibly wise toward the end of some really hard phase of life.
What's strange about it is, while it seems to be Solomon, that son of David phrase can be any of the sons of David, specifically, like, most importantly, the kings, where it talks about the gatherer or the teacher. It's someone who was calling to all of Israel and leading over them. So traditionally we attribute this to Solomon in his old age, especially when he looks at his life in the rearview mirror and says, I messed it up. But the problem with that is Solomon, at least in his story in 1 Kings, he never seems to turn back. At the end of Solomon's life, we see him as an apostate who is loyal to many, many gods, and he seems like not the kind of person that would say the things that he says in Ecclesiastes towards the end of his life. But Solomon, more big picture, is understood as the king who had wisdom and had it to the full. We learned about the story in the beginning of his life where he asked God for wisdom, where God says to him, I'll give you anything you wish for. And he says, you've given me a great kingdom, but I don't know anything. I don't know how to go in or go out. I'm like a little child. I don't know To from Ra. We talked about the good and evil, the good and bad. The same thing that's at the tree, the knowing of good and evil. Solomon says, I don't have that. So what is really interesting here is how he sort of calls out, here's how it's mostly presented in Proverbs. And Proverbs does do a few things to say it doesn't always work out this way, but the main thrust of Proverbs really is raise your children right and they'll do right. But we see, and all of you see in your lives, that doesn't always happen. That's what Ecclesiastes is here to focus on and to remind us of. So much of the way that ancient Jewish people talked about things was in a dialogical format. So if you read, like Nathan and I, these like giant books of like the Mishnah and the Talmud, they're like commentaries on the law, but it'll be like, okay, here's this one line about the Sabbath, and here's what 50 different rabbis say about it. And one of them is, here's what Rabbi 1 says about it, and here's Rabbi 2 making fun of Rabbi 1 and saying, no, it's actually this. And it doesn't give you like a final answer. It just gives you this big list of 50 and says, here you go. We see the same kind of thing happening in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, where it's forcing us into these almost disagreeing stories, but it puts them all into the same book and wants us to hold them together and pursue wisdom through that.
Yeah. And sorry, my voice cracked really bad right there. And the book comes out the gate swinging. It doesn't hold back, because you end off Proverbs on a nice note, and then the very first thing you read is that the words of the preacher or the teacher or the gatherer, just somebody who's collecting people together for the sake of teaching them something about God's wisdom. Yeah. The son of David, king in Jerusalem, and he says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, everything is vanity.
Hevel of hevels.
Yeah. And some of your translations might say meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And that's what they talked about in the video, that what that word is in Hebrew, and Ethan just repeated it. And it's hevel. And hevel can mean meaningless, but it's a little bit more packed than that.
Right. In Hebrew, this might get too complicated. They most of how the language works is that their vocabulary, their actual words are only 3 letters long. And they only have like 22 letters in the alphabet. So they can't actually make that many different words. So what they had to do in Hebrew most of the time is use words in 2 or 3 different ways, depending on if you were talking about actual smoke or if you were talking about what smoke is like. We see this with ruach, talk about in spirit, but it's also the word for wind. So we use this the same way to say something about life is like smoke. That's what we're really getting after here is something hevel-like about it that we almost can't grasp.
Yeah, it's very, smoke is really the best analogy because you know where it comes from.
Yeah.
And you know where it goes. You know, it comes from something burning and then it just floats up, but then it's just, it's gone.
What's important is that it looks like something that you can touch.
Yeah.
That you can grab onto. And then when you do, it just puffs out.
And it's a very fleeting,
Yeah.
just kind of fanciful thing that just kind of follows the wind. And it's a strange thing for just the wisest person on earth to take a look at all of life and call life nothing but smoke, equating it to just a puff of smoke.
It's worthless.
And we see that this teacher has a reason for thinking that, though, because it says that he tried to pursue everything that life has to offer. But he gives the very strict qualifier, though, of everything under the sun.
Under the sun. Good.
Like it's, and there's a few different ideas what we mean by that. But
As I said in the video, it's the sun. Under the sun is outside of the garden.
Yeah.
We've also talked about that could be. How did you say it?
well, it's everything under the sun is everything under the heavens.
Yeah.
And they understood that God is in the heavens. So how do I look for meaning in life from everything that's not from heaven? And that's really what this person, this teacher, Solomon, whoever, this king, is saying that he went searching for. And he says he goes searching in 3 particular places. It says wisdom is the first one, pleasure, and then he searches for it in work, doing hard, honest work. And what does he wind up saying about trying to find meaning in life in wisdom?
Didn't find much there. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
and it's interesting because if this is Solomon, a guy who's given wisdom specifically by God, it's intriguing. Like his whole kingship is defined by being the smart guy, the wise guy.
Yeah.
People came from all over to talk to him. And he says, my wisdom is, I tried to find meaning in that, but it's like trying to hold on to smoke. Because the more he discovered, the more he understood that he didn't understand. That's just how all knowledge works. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't actually know. And I watched a comedian one time, and it was hilarious. He was talking about how literally nothing makes any sense. He was like, you think you're sitting here in a chair listening to a person, but really, you got to zoom out. You're on a planet. You think that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. You're on a ball of dirt hurtling through space at hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, and you just don't feel it or think about it. And that little ball of dirt is suspended in infinite nothingness, and the infinite nothingness, wait for it, is getting bigger. That doesn't make any sense. And these are the kind of problems you run into whenever you try to put all of your life's hope into wisdom. You're always going to brush up against that thing that you don't know. You're going to brush up where human wisdom and experience and knowledge fails. Or even if you have the wisdom, it doesn't help. Like if somebody loses a loved one, and you just tell them, time heals all wounds, and you rub their back, they're going to be like, don't touch me. That's not helpful right now. Yeah. Wisdom can fail you.
At least, especially when you put it in the center. When you make your orbit about it, we talk about this a lot in sermons. What do we see as being in the middle of our lives? What do we orbit everything else around? And Solomon seems to actually make it wisdom, or his smarts, and he makes everything else go around that, and he sees it fail very badly.
And then he talks about pleasure, about trying to find meaning inside of pleasure, which, I mean, if you're somebody who basically has an endless bank account like a king, you can get
the
up,
best shot at that.
you can get up to whatever nonsense you want to get up to.
Sure.
The world, I mean, as far as the Middle East goes, your very sandy, hot world is your oyster. And he talked about trying to fill himself with food and with wine and having pleasurable company, but he just winds up saying that too is just like trying to cling on to smoke. And he winds up saying, so I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For everything is hevel and a striving after the wind.
Yeah. He throws amazing parties. But as all parties do, they come to an end. Monday always comes. And that's what Solomon's kind of grasping onto here is no matter what I try to do for myself as far as seeking pleasure, it ends, or it becomes empty to me. That Monday always comes, and what we'll see him fix onto later when he talks about death is the capital M Monday, the last Monday, final death.
Yeah.
You got 70 years, right, or so. I think he actually says man has about 70 years and then it's over. And it's actually not that big. We think it's big because that's as long a life as anyone gets, and you kind of get bored living for 70 years, or you start to look old. But Solomon's saying this is actually very, very small. Kingdoms rise and fall. God lives for thousands of years so far, but our lives are small.
Yeah, and he really starts to unpack time and death as he kind of winds down the end of his search. It says here in some translations it'll say the vanity of toil, but what he really means is just hard work. So doing well at your job. He's going to be a good king. He's going to administrate well. He's going to handle the funds well. He is going to build things, expand portions of the city, help the poor. Like, he's going to try to do things well as a king, and yet he just says of work, for all of his sorrows, for all of his days are full of sorrow. He's talking about man. For all of his days are full of sorrow, and work is vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. So work too is hevel.
Oh yeah. Another thing he says is, like, even if you do work hard and amass all this wealth, amass all these things, like building a business or something like that, eventually you die and you have to give it to someone else who didn't work for it at all, and they squander it. They just throw it in the trash because they didn't have to work to gather all this wealth or possessions, and it gets ruined. Hevel.
Yeah. And so it's once he finally exhausts all the places he can think of to work and to look for meaning, he finally focuses on time and what that means, and he goes into this big long back and forth. And you all are familiar with it. You know, it's just a time to be born. For everything under heaven, there's a time.
Yeah.
So a time to be born, a time to die, to plant, to take up, to kill or to heal, to break down, to build up, to weep, to laugh. And he says that everything you can possibly think of has an appointed time.
There's a Beatles song about that, right?
It's not the Beatles, but there is a song. Man, there's a season. Turn.
I'm 21.
the Birds?
I'm sorry. Birds.
There we go. See, I didn't get that band name wrong for but he winds up talking about how time can be a really, really big burden, because he says this in chapter 3. He has made everything beautiful in its time, he being God, and he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. So we're people, and we understand that we have this little bitty bit of time on earth.
Puny humans. Sorry.
And yet we can grasp that there's something beyond that, or there should be something beyond that.
And
even if we do interact with God by acknowledging his eternity and everything else, we can't ever actually fully understand what he's doing or where the ship seems to be going. And you can do that on both the micro and the macro, even within our little bits of lives. Whenever things seem to go wrong, like how everything seems to go wrong for this teacher, he's saying, I know there's going to be another day. And he talks about, even in this same passage, that whatever God does endures forever, so nothing can be added to it. So he knows God's got something coming down the pipe for me, but I don't know what that is, and that's troubling, and that's bothersome.
Yeah. We see that happen a lot in Job, and we've talked about this some, but that where these terrible things happen to Job, and it seems to be for no reason. And when he asks God, I demand an audience with God, and God doesn't give him really a straight answer. He just shows him some sea monsters, and then the book is over. It just, we don't actually get to see the whole arc of the story, at least yet.
Yeah. And so that's whenever he really talks about how basically everybody, not just the wise and the powerful, but everybody is stuck. You're just stuck with Hevel, whether you like it or not. Because he says that time, which we've already talked about, and then ultimately death, are going to be the great equalizers for everything. It doesn't matter who you are. It's coming, it's like, what are the only two things that are sure in life? It's death and taxes. And so death is always coming, and no matter what meaning you can seem to find or conjure up for yourself, death's going to come in and take it away.
Well, that's a great place to end it, Nathan. Thank you all. Have a nice Sunday. Right, but so much of that in Ecclesiastes is this doom and gloom, everything stinks. Hevel, I'm using my own language here, but it's all just no good. And I think Ecclesiastes totally could just leave us there and leave us to sit in that pile of dirt and mud and just say, woe is me, life stinks, guess I'll go eat worms.
Yeah.
But he doesn't. And we see some of that toward the end.
Yeah. And I think and before we kind of get to where the book ultimately leads us.
Ray of sunshine.
A little teeny tiny 2 verses of sunshine and 12 chapters of Hevel. Everything is doom and gloom and meaningless. There was one portion of this that kind of, I want to take a moment to kind of pry back a little bit on some of the stuff in Ecclesiastes, because I think there's a certain point in here where we live in a culture where everything is hyper relativized, right? If you don't like what the culture is saying, you march to the beat of your own drum. You don't like it, it's not even just like, you come home with your hair cut with a mohawk and a nose piercing and say, I'm not using the name you and father gave me anymore, Mom. And it's not a phase. Like, it's anything you can think of, you can relativize. You can make up your own meaning to everything in the culture. And so whenever you tell people, well then what do we do with this lack of meaning? And say, well, you just make up your own meaning, whatever feels good to you for your lifetime. And that's so that just, it rings so hollow, because
Yeah.
ultimately it's gonna go away. And people say, well, we try to make our mark on this life, and yet what you were saying earlier, time passes and everything crumbles. Surprise, surprise, the worship guy likes poetry. But my favorite poem is a very kind of surly, almost bitter poem, but it's a poem just called Ozymandias, and it's written by a guy named Lord Shelley. And he writes, and it's about King Ramses, the guy who built up vast quantities in Egypt. Like half of everything in Egypt, if you go and be a tourist, is named after the guy.
Ramses.
Like he's just the most popular pharaoh of all time. And the poem is about a tourist who goes, and he walks up with the tour guide and sees a plaque. And on this big plaque, there are these big giant concrete legs coming out of it, and they're broken off at the knees. And kind of a distance away, there's a half eroded away face just laying in the sand. And on this plaque, really big, it says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty, and despair." And the poem ends off by noting that it's just an empty desert and there's nothing left.
Yeah.
And we can try to say that we can create our own meaning, or we can try to make meaning by being altruistic. But the writer says that that's ultimately going to go away. So one of the biggest battles right now in our culture, hard work versus redistribution. Ecclesiastes even says, okay, that's fine and all, but it's ultimately meaningless, because he talks about how even if Proverbs works out and God takes from the unjust and all of their earnings and then gives it to the blessed, that's meaningless, because you're always going to need more. Anything that we can think of, be it our pleasure, our identity, our gender, our orientation, whatever it is, it's ultimately going to come up as smoke or chasing after the wind. And we know that because once you're dead, it's just gone. And even if you're cool and mighty like Ozymandias or this or that, eventually you're going to be lost to time.
It's that he says we come into this world naked, and the same we return. Just like we see animals die, we are going to die too. Don't forget that, the teacher says. I like that poem because, and this might be like when you explain a joke and it ruins it, but that statue says, "Look at my works and despair," I think was probably originally intended to say, like, look how huge my towers are. You could never build something as big as and amazing as this, you puny kings. But then when you see all of it washed away by sand and just nothing, and read that same thing, look at my works and despair, you still despair, because no matter how big of a tower I build, no matter how much I gather in life, whether it's wisdom, money, anything like that, it all just washes away. Hevel of Hevels. Smoke, gone.
And part of the reason why we're going to focus a bit on Ecclesiastes is slightly because I partially asked for it, because this is my favorite book of the Bible, don't you know, because everything's meaningless.
You like sitting in the...
I like festering in meaninglessness. But I feel this book like in my marrow. Like, it's just, this book is rough, but all at the same time, it's always stood out to me just because it's, I've had problems with this in my life, and not because I'm like Solomon and because I can search out every little thing, but because I have, to my limited capability in life, searched out random different things and tried different things. And I genuinely kind of came to this point whenever I was really young. Because, like, here's a little snapshot of my life my life has not been hard, right? Like, I watched a sitcom where like something very menial happens to the main character and she starts crying and she's like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And everybody's like, the worst? And she just goes, I've lived a very privileged life. Wow. And anytime I get upset about anything, that's what I feel like.
That's me.
So like I grew up, I was born across the street and then basically here I am.
You had these people as parents.
Yes, but I had these two as parents, and they're lovely.
How good can it get?
Happy
Father's Day.
I have very, very good, very loving parents. Like on all of me and my siblings, you take a poll, we all unanimously agree, and we had very good, stable home. They both had stable jobs,
Yeah.
like average American home, quiet little neighborhood. Mom,
picket fence.
Dad, like the only thing we didn't have was the picket fence because there'd just be too much fence.
Yeah.
The yard was too big. But like there was, 2.5 children and a dog. Like
2.5?
2 to 3
Okay.
replacement rates.
Yeah.
Like the carved like cutout of American dream life.
Yeah.
That was my life. I did not want for things as a kid. I really didn't. And if you've seen pictures of me where I was approximately yay big and yay round, you'll know I did not want for anything. And yet, I've always had a tendency to be kind of up in my head a lot of the time. I genuinely don't remember this at all, but like whenever I was younger, I remember in like 4th or 5th grade or something, we were reading the book Holes, where they dig holes. And being like a 9 or 10-year-old, because girls develop spatially and emotionally way before guys do. Apparently the teacher would ask somebody in the class, deliberately trying to get boys to engage, and she'd ask one boy, how do you think this character feels? And they'd be like, sad. And then like I said, I don't remember this, but at like a parent-teacher conference, this is from the word of my parents, that the teacher would come to me and say, how do you think this character feels? And like, I would talk, and I would give like emotions. So for a very long time, I've been a feely internal thing. And it can be to my own detriment because I will sit there and I will think on things and think on things and think on things until I want to fall apart.
Yeah.
If I did not know Jesus, I would probably just go the way of the dodo bird, like, H.P. Lovecraft or like Nietzsche, and just go crazy, genuinely. Because at some point when I was very young in my life, I kind of hit this wall, this specific wall, where I was like, I have a good life. I'm not sad. I'm not depressed. I just feel kind of hollow because I'm just going to get up, do some stuff, and go to bed. And I'm going to keep doing that. That's my existence. I get up, I do stuff, I go to bed, and then eventually you just die.
Huh.
You do that over and over and over again. And something about, being so young and seeing the monotony of that for like 70 more years really, really bothered me. And it pushed me to a place where I almost irrevocably harmed myself. And thankfully I didn't, and I had, and I told key people in my life about it later on, and they kept a very, very close and watchful eye on me ever since because they love me and they care about me. But I've hit this wall in my life where everything seems pointless and meaningless, and you just hate life. Not because woe is me, everything is despair. I have... it's like a country song. I lost my wife, my truck, my dog, my house. Like that wasn't me.
You had a nice day.
I had a good life,
Yeah.
But just the oppression of everything seeming to be meaningless made me genuinely kind of hate life for a little bit. But I wasn't sad. So I feel this in my bones.
Yeah.
And so whenever we come to what the author finally tells us, it's kind of underwhelming. It's very, very underwhelming after 12 straight chapters of everything is hevel and life is like trying to cling on to smoke.
Yeah.
All he tells us, because there are two different voices throughout Ecclesiastes. There's the preacher, and then for the last about 5 verses or so of the book, there's a totally different person who's the author, the person who compiled Ecclesiastes.
We see him in the first verse as well, where he says, "These are the words of the teacher."
Yeah.
And then they just jump right into it.
He speaks at the very end of the book, after all this just doom and gloom and oppression of vanity, it just says, the end of the matter, or life, or trying to find meaning in life, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And that's where we're left.
Yeah.
And like there's meaning here. So let's try to unpack, because the author clearly doesn't think life is totally meaningless, because a few different times in the book he says it's good, it's a gift from God that a man should enjoy his work and do it well, that he should enjoy his food and his company.
Yeah.
With the very strict understanding that it's going to end. So how is living life with eternity in mind somehow meaningful?
Yeah, that's the best part of that. And I think we put it up. This is the last few verses of the book. That's the author coming in, and he says, God's going to make everything right. He's going to judge the good and the evil. And ultimately, it's some way of saying it's not all meaningless. It's not all going the way of the dodo. It's going to be made right. So much of like this big story of the Bible that we see everywhere is God is, he sees the brokenness, he sees the pain, and he is working to redeem it. We see the Bible is this huge story of redemption. If you look at the whole scripture, that's one really important thing to get out of it, is that God is working to make things new again. But most of Ecclesiastes and most of the wisdom literature really steps out of the whole story of the Bible. That's what kind of sets these books apart, is they're not talking about kings and kingdoms and trees and adultery like the rest of the Bible is. It steps out and it says, how do we live a good life? How do we find joy? How do we find meaning in this 70 years under the sun that we have? Because ultimately, we're outside of the Garden of Eden, where God is fully present with us, and he's fully providing us life and giving us wisdom. And we don't have that right now. And Ecclesiastes is really trying to remind us, don't forget that right now is not enough for you. And we have eternity on our hearts, but we die in 70 years. But that doesn't mean that it's all nothing, that God will be making it right. This is actually the first book that I read all the way through as a kid, which is strange as well. But so much of like what I got from it in the first place was that we try to control our lives. We try to control these circumstances. 3 big things that Ecclesiastes complains about is the march of time, everything being washed away over time, randomness, where things seem to be unpredictable, so many I forget how Ecclesiastes puts it. They put it like this several times, but many times I have seen the wicked man prosper. I have seen him live a long life while the righteous man dies early and he has nothing. It's randomness. Proverbs is saying everything goes the way it should if you follow God. Ecclesiastes is not so. And it reminds us we're outside of the garden, and if we try to control this, we're going to fail. The last thing he complains about is death. He says we all die, and it makes everything meaningless. But I think what he ultimately wants us to walk away with is this posture that we find at the end of the book. The last few verses of chapter 12 is follow the commandments, remember God is coming to judge everything, to make everything right. And so with what you have, hold it like this. We practice this posture a lot. I sit in these chairs too. And we remember that everything that we have is a gift. We didn't earn it. It is not ours to hold on to. But it is something from God, and we have to be free to remember God gives and God takes away. And everything that he does is for our good. Even if it doesn't seem like it and it really hurts and is smoky. It all, we're meant to give up control of our lives and to, even in our suffering, even when things are bad and they're really bad, they are God's, and God is for us. And that just, as he struggles with here, doesn't make sense to us here, but we have to remember there's a bigger picture happening. We are so small and we don't see it.
Yeah. Yep. And it seems so very, very unhelpful to spend the entire book talking about how meaningless life is, and then the ultimate answer is to just, but enjoy life. And yet the author gives it that specific caveat of knowing, though, that you have to speak with God about your life. And to me, it brings my mind immediately, because we are outside of the garden, but the purpose of the garden was to walk with God. Yeah. And so it brings of what does this life actually look like, and Jesus had a thing or two to say about it. In John chapter 15, he says this, he says to abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he is that which bears much fruit. Yep. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch that withers, and branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love, and if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be with you, and that your joy may be full. And a little bit further down, it just says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give to you. These things I have commanded you, so that you will love one another. And I think there's something, it seems so underwhelming, yet something kind of very, very profound about thinking that maybe the whole secret to meaning in life is that it's not on you to give it meaning. There's not some magic thing you have to go do to make your life meaningful. Like, all of us kind of have main character syndrome. Like, everybody wants to be Luke Skywalker.
Okay.
Nobody wants to be just the blue elephant dude who just kind of hung out in Jabba's bar playing piano. Nobody wants to be that guy, right? Nobody, but we all feel like I have to find the special thing. I got to do something to make life worth it, to do this, do that. So there's got to be something I can do, and we scrounge around and we feel desperate. But
Ecclesiastes, it functions as a huge defeater to all of that aspiration. It looks for everything under the sun, everything but God, and says all of it, every bit of it is not enough. And so what we see Ecclesiastes do as serving this really negative, like terrible, awful, sad function, what we see when it creates this big empty hole in us, it makes a hole so big that only one thing can fill it. It's what makes the good news so good, is that nothing else is good.
yeah. And so it doesn't leave you on a point of brokenness. The book really tears you down just with the expectation that you'll be built back up to understand that your life has meaning because God has set eternity on your heart, because you were designed to abide with God in the garden, not under the sun and meaningless toil, but with God. And God has made provision for that, as we see through the person of Jesus. And he makes room for us to abide with God once again. And that's ultimately where everything winds up going in Revelation. We wind up abiding with God again in a garden. But in the meantime, our lives are a gift, and they're meant to be lived. And we're not necessarily, do good things, do awesome things,
Very good.
Build something really great and amazing that people will remember. Go skydiving, do or don't.
To the glory of God.
But what Paul tells us in Colossians in 3, it just says, but whatever you do in word or in deed, do everything in the name of Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So maybe life isn't meant to be you desperately searching for meaning, but rather God giving you meaning by making a way for you to abide with him.
We see the same, where are you going? We see the same kind of ending at the end of Song of Songs. We saw it in the video where they end up as a couple united under a fruit tree. It's supposed to be painted as like this Garden of Eden picture. And that we're meant to be brought back to that. I forgot where I was going with that, man. But, we see the author of Ecclesiastes doesn't talk much about that, but he points us toward it. He points us toward the ultimate point of everything is to get your meaning from God, to not take it for yourselves. That's a lot of how Solomon is presented in his story in 1 Kings. Is he says, I don't have the knowledge of good and evil for myself. I need to receive it from God. What this really important idea about in the garden, what would happen if we didn't take from the tree of knowing good and evil? We would have had to still know good and evil somehow, because the reason we were created is to rule over creation and to represent God to the rest of the world. We would still need to have some know-how of how to do that. But what's important is if we would have relied on God for that. It talks about God walking in the cool of the day. It's not a hard jump to make that God intended to teach us how to fulfill our role as we went, but instead we take it for ourselves. And so we see Solomon depicted the same way in his story. He is standing there in front of the tree saying, am I going to take wisdom for myself, or am I going to let God? And Solomon is one of the very few characters who at first pulls his hand back. And That's a really important part of Solomon's life. And why he's depicted as the most wise is because he sees, I can't do it for myself. It needs to be from God. And that's, I can't stress that enough.
Yeah. And so I'm going to, there's not much more to add. The Bible says it plainly enough, that it's a gift from God that you would enjoy your life, but to also live that life fearing Him and knowing one day you'll have to see Him and give an account, but also know that He made provision for you to abide with Him. And if you don't know what that looks like to abide with God through the person of Jesus, then grab David or Adam or Tisha, me, Carrie, like anybody, any of the deacons, Ethan, and to understand what that looks like to abide with God with the person of Jesus. But also, it'd be to our own detriment if we didn't point out that in the same passage that Jesus says, abide with me and I with you, He also puts in that very specific line of, and I abide with you so that you may love one another. And so that as we go about life in light of Jesus, and that gives us our meaning, because it's not something we do, so it's not something that can be taken away from us, that we're meant to find that meaning and to live in that meaning together. It pulls us out of our escapism, to think, I just live for heaven one day, because Ecclesiastes says, no, you live your life now. But it also takes things out of your hands and says, you are not in your satisfaction, or ultimately not the meaning. It's greater than us. And that is the work that God has given us. So ultimately, the meaning of life is to live well by loving God and loving your fellow man.
A part of the eternal life that God gives to us. We have to experience that now. It's not just for later when we die. It's not for the final end stage of life that everything is made right. We have to see it now. We have to see it in our hearts, in our lives, in our view of God, is that He's giving us life now. It's not just for later.
So I think there's not a whole lot more we can add.
Amen.
We want to invite everybody to take this moment to respond, if the band wants to come back up. And in this response time, just it's okay to grapple with Ecclesiastes and the density of it, and to acknowledge the hardship of life, that things can feel meaningless and like smoke, but it's not meaningless. Thank you. That you do have meaning, and it's given to you by the person of Jesus. And if you don't know what that meaning is like, then we would love to share with you. In the meantime, just remember to abide with Him, and He will abide with you, and love one another. And that's life.